Welcome back to Arguing with the Internet. On this week's episode, we're going to be exploring the question, do we work too much? So this week, we're going to follow a similar format as we did last episode, wherein we find comments and arguments from the internet, pull them, show them to you, and sort of dissect them. Actually argue with the internet. Hopefully, we can cover a few more than we were able to last time.
Right.
So how about we hop into that right away? Lewis, you have the first one, I believe.
Yeah, this comes from Reddit, from the Ask Women subreddit. So the question is, do you believe the 40-hour work week is outdated? Why or why not? And this person responds, I think the 40-hour work week was designed for men who would go home to a clean house, a meal on the table, and all the errands already taken care of by their wives who could stay home. If I didn't have to cook, clean, and run errands, I'd have no problem working a 40-hour week. The problem is when I have to come home and spend 3 hours doing chores and only get a few hours of free time. At this point, most 40-hour jobs don't offer families the ability to survive on a single income. Both parents have to work, come home, do chores, and then pass out without much free time. All right, so I think there's a couple things going on here. So this alludes a bit to the history of the way that we work, the 40-hour work week, which is, in some ways arbitrary. It was, designed by or pioneered by, Henry Ford in a very different time. And so maybe the conditions that made that, a good idea at the time aren't really the same as how things are now. And then also, it's kind of this distinction between different types of work, because, the housework this person alludes to is a kind of work, but it seems to be different than work that you get paid for, whatever you do in your normal 9-to-5 job. So you got any thoughts about this, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like there's different types of work. I don't think anyone, at least today, is going to deny that, like, doing necessary domestic chores is, not work at all, right? I mean, if you've ever had to clean your house, most of us have, right? It's labor intensive, right? So there's certainly work involved. But it does seem to be of a different kind. It might just be because in one case you're working for someone, like in your typical 9-to-5, right? The standard 9-to-5 employee is an employee of someone else. Whereas doing these sort of household chores is like a necessity for oneself.
Right. And I think the way people view those are very different too, because you can be a stay-at-home parent and do all the child rearing and whatever domestic chores need to be done, which is a lot of work, but you don't get paid anything for that, and society doesn't value it necessarily the same way they value like wage labor. But if you do the same thing for another person's family, then it is somehow valuable. Even though you're doing the exact same thing, it's just not for your family, not for your children.
Right.
And some people think that's somehow better. But yeah, in any case, it's viewed differently.
But I mean, in the larger scope of what this person is trying to get at, it does seem to be the case that a single 40-hour work week job doesn't carry the weight that it used to, right? I mean, they're alluding to the times and sort of like you described, like the Henry Ford era, right? Where a single person in the family could work for 40 hours, not only provide for themselves and a spouse, but make house payments, provide for their children, vehicle, etc. I've heard arguments kind of go both ways where this is concerned, I should say. One is that it seems to be the case that while hours worked on average is increasing and productivity is increasing to a great extent, take-home earnings is not, right? So earnings aren't going along with increased productivity, which is a problem given that things cost more nowadays, right? And that's why this sort of single 40-hour work week salary isn't cutting it anymore. That's kind of an empirical matter. Everything that I've seen seems to suggest that that's the case. Suppose we can throw some things up on screen here, in terms of the facts of the matter. I don't have them memorized, so I won't state them.
Right. But yeah, it's pretty rare nowadays to have, much more rare to have a one person provide the income for, two adults and children. I mean, that's just
Right.
is not possible in the way that it used to be possible. And as you said, the value of the workers has, in some sense, increased because people are more productive. They're able to get more done, more output from whatever labor they put in, but they're not getting compensated to match that productivity, which, sucks.
Well, on the other side of things, I have heard arguments that go something like, yeah, it's true, a 40-hour work week, like a single member of the family working 40 hours doesn't go as far as it used to, but there are far more expenses now that are, in some sense, unnecessary that didn't exist then. So it's not. Maybe there's a little truth to the notion that we're getting paid less where it compares to like spending power is concerned, but it's also true that we are buying, the latest iPhone, or that we have to have like the best internet and cable plans, or if anyone has cable anymore,
Right.
but like paying for all these streaming services and things, and these are things that they weren't really around when we're talking about this single worker household era, right?
Right. So, yeah, the standard of living has increased, or at least we have like more fun things to do, more like access to entertainment. But I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem that bad of a trade to not have to work so much and like not having all this. I mean, a lot of it is a necessity. Like you need internet to work in a lot of cases. Like these things that seem like
Sure.
luxuries are, they become necessities, and you're constantly comparing yourself to other people around you. So maybe it's just not possible to live in the
Right. I mean, I think
more
it's a
simple
better
way.
move to say that some of these things, while they appear to be luxuries in compared to what was around in like the 30s or something like
Yeah.
that, they are not. They might be more necessary than you think. Like you mentioned, an internet connection. I mean,
Mm.
especially in these days where we have just seen like every student, in the U.S. has been
Yeah.
doing, like remote learning. I mean, they're back in person now, but for, over a year, it was
Hmm.
an internet connection, not just that, but a computer with a functional webcam, etc. All of these things, which might
Right.
have been regarded as a luxury even a decade ago, seem to be necessities now. However, I don't think that necessarily applies to things like the latest iPhone, or uh, like the all the streaming services. Like I can't just have one; I have to have all of them.
Right.
And what the a few years ago there was that popular meme that, targeting millennials, that it was like, if you stop having your avocado toast in the
Right.
morning, maybe you could afford. It's kind of this argument kind of goes in that vein. Um, but when you talk about avocado toast, that's a bit petty, right? When you talk about like multi-$1,000 phones when others are available, it seems a little less petty, right? Like there might be some truth to it.
Yeah. And that gets into the issue of, how much work are you willing to do to make more money, or to like to have a better
Mm-hmm.
standard of living? Like some people are willing to put in, 60 plus hours or whatever to increase their standard of living. And it reminds me of something I read about where the employees at Kellogg, the cereal company, they had a 30-hour work week like during the Great Depression, so that they could schedule
Mm-hmm.
like two shifts of people, and they actually voted. The workers themselves voted to have a 40-hour work week brought
Mm.
back, and it seems to be because they wanted to earn more money so that they could have more stuff. Like this is during, I think, the 50s, when there was this consumerist explosion.
Mm-hmm.
So there is something to that. I mean, there's this balance of, how much do you want to work versus how much earning power do you want?
Right. But in terms of this person's argument, where it seems entirely reliant on this one-to-one comparison of like when the 40-hour work week was a thing that could be done by one person in the household and like everyone's making ends meet, versus now where that seems nearly impossible, at least for quite a few people, if not the majority of people. The comparison is under threat by this notion that, well, we have more unnecessary expenditures now. And if you were to just like loosen up on your consumerism, right? Perhaps there really isn't that much difference. Now, I will say I am skeptical that even if you were, to buy the cheapest phone you could, and have the lowest quality internet possible, and like no entertainment whatsoever, I'm still skeptical that like the average salary for a 40-hour work week would be completely sufficient for all of the things that it was supplying in the 50s, etc.
Right.
Right?
I mean, it definitely depends on where you live too. I mean, some places are just so expensive to live, the rent or the cost of housing, especially with the housing prices that have increased the last year or two. Just outside of living with like 5 roommates or more, like just the
Right.
cost of living, the bare essentials are really gonna, you're not gonna go as far as you could in back in the 20s or 40s or whenever.
Right. Another thing that kind of falls out of this person's argument that I mean, I'm not sure it's intended, but it is somewhat implied, is that they're more or less saying there's nothing wrong with the 40-hour work week in principle, right? A 40-hour work week in principle is okay so long as all of your needs are being met, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, based on the way they've placed their argument here, it seems like they would be fine with the 40-hour work week if it still worked the same way it did like in the 50s, right? Where a single 40-hour work week is enough for a whole family, or at least a couple, to survive on, allowing one to handle all of the household sort of work and that sort of thing. But there are people today who are arguing that a 40-hour work week in principle is not good, right?
Yeah, you really have to decide what amount of your life is worth working. I mean, 40 hours a week, it's a little less than half your waking hours, because if you sleep 8 hours, you still have the weekends where you're not working, so it's sort of less than half. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how you can really settle on like a clear, this is how many hours you should be working. To some people it seems like too much, to some people it seems fine. Some people it might seem like you're being lazy and it's too little. So yeah, I guess it's a personal preference. I don't know how you like put a number.
There are a lot of discussions over like quantifying the hours worked and like how many is. Yeah, I mean, one thing people like to say on the internet, is people talk about a 40-hour work week, but that doesn't include commuting or like a mandatory break, where you're not technically working per se, but you also aren't exactly free to leave or do anything you want. You're still kind of on the hook for showing back up in an hour, 30 minutes, whatever you might have.
In a lot of places too, the email or Slack, certain communication is expected outside of normal work hours, and so you're never
both
really
of us
able
have
to...
been involved in academia at different times in our lives. I still am to a certain extent, and it is, I mean, at least I can say anecdotally, pretty bad about that kind of thing. You get emails from students all hours of the night, and some of them are I don't know if urgent is the right word. Perhaps the students think so. You might have an essay that's due literally at midnight. A student emails you at 10 p.m. with a vital question, for their success. What do? Do you ignore it? I'm off. Um, it's hard.
Yeah, you
So
have to
yeah,
go out of your way to set boundaries and expectations, and but that's the expectation, or the default is you're on all the time, and
right.
how can you
Especially if you're
really
getting
relax?
emails not from. So getting an email from a student is one thing. That you have a certain position of like authority there, but
Hmm.
if you are an employee and you get an email from your boss, that's an entirely different matter, right? If you ignore their email, that could be, not necessarily like at the peril of losing your job or anything like that. I mean, maybe that's
Hmm.
happened, but perhaps at the peril of like losing some reputation or whatever. Everyone's always trying to put their best foot forward and that kind of thing. Um, yeah.
Right. I've heard of the concept of LARPing your job, like doing live action role play of your job. Like, even if you're not actually doing the work that's involved, like responding to
Uh,
Slack or responding to emails showing I'm a productive worker. Like, I check,
right.
I'm always on. And like, even if you're not doing anything that's actually productive, that's something that
Right.
still is going to take up your time and energy.
Well, I think it's this classic idea that when it comes time for promotions or whatever, you're more likely to be the one they look at if you're the one who like answers promptly. You volunteer for additional tasks, that sort of thing. Was it Belgium that recently made it law that it's permissible not to respond to your employer after
Oh,
work hours?
I hadn't
Yeah,
heard
I
of that.
think they just made it a like a legal 4-day work week, or
Hmm.
was it 4 days? I think it's 4 days. Yeah, 4-day work week, and you don't have to respond to your boss after hours. It might even be firmer than that. It might be they can't contact you after hours.
Hmm.
But there are some jobs that have on call
Right.
positions, and with those, an entirely different story. That seems to be like innately part of the job that you respond after hours.
Yeah. All right. Well, do you think we should move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's move on. So this one comes from Reddit. Um, in response to a question about whether or not 40-hour work weeks should still exist or not, given how much mental strain, etc., they create, this person responds, "Totally unnecessary. We spend the majority of our lives working to make the rich richer, who hoard their wealth like some dragon. Spread the money around a wee bit, increase wages and lower working hours. 3 days of work, 4 days of play, and bring in universal basic income. I feel this is what will happen eventually due to improved technology. Tax the super rich and spread the wealth," right? With more colorful language that YouTube doesn't like. Uh, okay, so there's a lot going on here. I
Yeah.
mean, this is certainly like an aspirational post. These are things we should be doing. These are certainly not things we are doing currently, is what this person is saying. First of all, there's this notion that most of our labor is not benefiting us, but rather it is enriching those who are already incredibly wealthy, right? He
Hmm.
compares them to dragons who famously hoard their wealth for no real reason, right? Like dragons in stories do not spend their money, they just sleep on it, right?
Hmm.
And okay. Uh, they are advocating for 3 days of work, which is not something you see very often.
Right.
4-day
It's
work
pretty
week,
extreme.
occasional. You see that every now and then, but 3 days of work. Um, they're advocating for UBI, and there's this suggestion that UBI is this inevitable conclusion from improved technology. By that, I think they mean automation, right? The replacement of workers with machines, basically.
Right. Well, yeah, I
And
would
then
definitely
there's
say that.
wealth redistribution, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to There's a lot to poke at
Yeah.
here.
Well, I think that's an interesting point about universal basic income and how they think it'll be inevitable based on improved technology. But people have been predicting that our work weeks will basically be nothing or very little for 100 years or more,
Because of automation, right?
right? Because of advances in technology. So there was like a very famous prediction by an economist. I'm not going to say his name because I'm pretty sure I'm going to forget what it is. But it was about 1930. I want to say John Maynard Keynes, who had predicted that in 100 years, people would be working 15 hours a week because of advances in technology. And we're pretty close to that. They'll be in 2030. And we're definitely not working 15 hours a week. And the productivity gains that we've had were beyond anything that he could have imagined in 1930. Based on all the advances in technology that have just been like mind-boggling. So I think there's a lot in place that's keeping us from working fewer hours. I don't think it's something that's inevitable by any stretch of the imagination. It certainly could happen, but it seems like it hasn't happened, and I think it will continue not to happen unless there's something drastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to say that there are likely many reasons why that haven't happened. Some of them are more sinister than others, right? And perhaps I'll start with like the less sinister or like conspiracy driven, notions. One is that while productivity has gone up, so has the demand for work that was previously non-existent, like not even conceived of, right? Like now we have things like data scientists and people who program user interfaces and things like these jobs didn't exist until like 20, 30 years ago, something like that, right? So I mean, automation has made workers more efficiently and has made workers more efficient in things like factories and even on farms, right? Like if you look at a tractor now, I mean, you don't even need a driver anymore. You just plug in some GPS locations and the tractor goes and does everything that it needs to do.
Right.
But at the same time, there are new jobs that are not automated, right? So this idea that like technology is going to be this like pathway for all of us to become free of labor, I mean, that assumes that technology is going to be like capable of replacing human labor across the board, and that seems less likely when you're finding new kinds of work to do along the way, right? It takes time to automate a job away, especially one that requires like a creative mind or something. It's not just a mechanical job, screw in this nut here, hammer this nail down here. That kind of thing a machine can do.
Right. Yeah, I guess if you wanted to take the standard of living and how things were going in 1930, apart from the Great Depression, and just automate ways to make that society function as it is, not changing the society at all. Like you could probably have done that by the technology we have. But as you said, there are new jobs and new technologies breed new jobs, and skills are needed to perform those jobs, and there's more desirability for things that did not exist. So like we talked about iPhones and video games, things of that nature. It wouldn't have been possible to conceive of those things back then. But yeah, I mean, as automation increases, that changes how society is, and then you have more complexity that you can't just continue, making that go along with automation. So you do have some limits to that.
Now, on the more sinister side, or the I guess like a more negative outlook on the question as to how come automation has increased or technology has made us more productive, but we're still working just as much, if not more, right? One negative answer to that has to do with that feeling that if you've ever worked in manual labor or in a job where you have a certain kind of quota or something like that to meet by a certain time, you'll find there's this wisdom passed amongst the employees to one another, right? Don't work too hard, right? Don't work too hard. Why? Because you aren't going to be rewarded for it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's almost like you're punished for it because you will be given more work, right? So a possible reason why automation has been increasing and hours have not diminished is simply that employers are looking for every way they can to get more profit, which, I mean, implies that if they can work you more, even if you're more productive per hour worked, that's better for them, right? That's more profit, more productivity, more profit, right?
There's definitely some truth to that because a lot of the arguments I see for the 4-day work week has been a sort of trending topic, either for 10-hour days, so you're still doing 40 hours, or for 8-hour days, so you're basically cutting out 8 hours. A lot of the arguments for that are, hey, we have these employees that have more free time, and they like that we're valuing their work-life balance, and hey, they're actually more productive, or if nothing else, they're at least equally productive. And I think if you did not have that, if they were less productive, got less stuff done, you're not going to sell that to any business. Businesses aren't going to do that because they're not, they're not around to make workers happy. They're around to make money.
Right.
And anything that's going to get in the way of that isn't really going to last.
Well, I mean, it's complicated because there are some business models in which they need to meet certain demands, and thus their productivity is only measured insofar as the demands are met on time, right? That's really the only concern. We need to ship this product by this time. This applies especially for jobs where like coding and that kind of thing involves, right? You're not going to get more money for coding more unnecessarily, right? This is the task, finish the task, and that is the productivity we're looking for. In a job like that, it makes a lot of sense for a company to say the kind of thing you just mentioned, right? Where it's like, well, if we treat our employees well and we make sure they're well rested, they tend to be more productive. Yeah, because it's task oriented, right? They can focus more on this task and get it done. But when you're looking at something like, I don't know, like a factory line or something where it's the more product we make, the more product we sell, I'm not sure the same holds. I mean, it's somewhat of an empirical question, but while sure, like a well-rested employee might be more productive for the hours they work, if you take a slightly less productive employee and work them, like an additional 20 hours per week than that well-rested employee, you might still come out ahead, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case for that kind of business plan where it's like produce the most you can, I mean, it's still, if like their eye is on profit, that's still the best move for them.
Right. I think it does depend on the type of work. So like manufacturing, things like that, that you don't need necessarily concentration, or I guess you could have concentration, but like something you kind of, once you know how to do it, it's more rote. Like those types of things, like the more you're there, the more you're going to get done, unless you're so exhausted that you make a mistake that's
right.
Something really bad happens, someone gets injured. Barring things like that, the more you're there, the more work you're going to get done. But other types of jobs, like people call it knowledge work, where you're coding, or things where you're having to use I guess more intellectual capacity. You're coming up with new ideas, new knowledge. Once you pass a certain point of work, you might do worse work,
right?
Which can actually have a negative impact depending on what it is you're doing. You might produce a worse product or a worse service. That it would be better off if you worked fewer hours, got less done, but it was better quality work. So yeah. it does depend on the specific circumstances of the job.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the circumstance you mentioned, which I hadn't even I didn't think of when I was initially bringing this up. When the quality of your work is going to be the difference between someone living and dying, right? Like a surgeon, for example, or something like that. It might be even more valuable to have a well-rested, high quality over high output productivity sort of mindset there. But yeah, I mean, there are even more sort of negative conspiratorial outlooks on the notion as to, why do we still work so much given that automation is, or at least it seems like we should have achieved a certain level of automation, that kind of thing. One of those, and this one is fairly conspiratorial, I think, but is still heard in a few circles on the internet, is that it's the case because they, whoever they are, right, want to keep us occupied, right? Because so long as we're occupied doing especially trivial, menial work, you don't have time to organize, right? You don't have time to massively protest or anything like that. I have no evidence for such a claim, but it's out there.
No, and I could definitely have seen it more like in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, where people were working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Like, they had no time to do anything else. Like,
right.
And people did protest or revolt and put their lives on the line for that, but that was just because they were at the breaking point. I mean, most of them couldn't really think that far ahead. It was just they were in survival mode.
Right. I mean, at this point, I think it's also important that we make a distinction between, again, this kind of comes down to different kinds of work that we mentioned when we were discussing the previous comment. But I don't think anyone is going to be objecting to doing 40 hours of work, like if you own a homestead or like your own like small farm or something like that, and you're subsistence farming. And this is like what you live to do, like you wake up and you really just want to live on the land, that kind of thing, right? I don't think anyone's calling for that to be abolished, right? Like, oh, those people shouldn't be allowed to do that kind of thing. It seems more like people are exclusively concerned with a 40-hour work week wherein you are employed by someone else, right?
Right. It's a situation where you either work the 40 hours or you're in poverty or you can't have a home, you're homeless, and so that's sort of the alternative. But in situations where you're your own boss and you can decide for yourself how much work is enough.
Right. It's some like entrepreneurs, people with their own businesses, they're still in the practice of trading their labor essentially for money. But it's a much more direct trade in their case. When you are working for someone else, you are trading your labor and receiving money from someone else who also takes a bit of it, right? Because that's the whole idea out of having a job. You don't reap 100% of the profits of your labor. If you did, there would be nothing for the employer, right?
Right.
So you get a partial return back on your labor. I think that is what people are talking about for the most part when they're discussing these like changes to the 40-hour work week. Going down to 4 work days, or in this guy's case 3.
Right.
Which maybe isn't so absurd, especially if their idea of improved technology is realistic. I'm not convinced that it is at this point. Maybe in the future, but right now it doesn't seem like we have the means to automate, especially these highly in-demand jobs we see today, like various coding jobs and things like that.
Yeah. But one thing I do wonder is, if we could somehow, if we knew exactly how much work needed to be done to sustain society, and really looked at how much work was actually being done, how those would match up. Because I know like I haven't had a job like this specifically, but I know a lot of people have jobs where they basically don't do anything. They just like are on social media all day. They maybe like go to a meeting, respond to some emails. They maybe do like up to 3 hours of work a day.
Well, let's not let's avoid if we can dismissing some work as not work. No matter how tempting it may be, because there are social media managers, and people like that who like that's all they do. That's what they're employed to do. I assume their work is in some way increasing the profit margin of a company. So it's got to have some value, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much like empirical work there is on this, but there was this book that I read called BS Jobs by David Graeber, where he asked people to write in about jobs they had that they thought weren't contributing to society at all.
Okay.
And so some of them were like a receptionist that worked for a super small company that didn't do anything, but the company just wanted to have a receptionist so they could be considered seen to be a certain type of company. Like, we have a receptionist, we're reputable. And so, this is again like all based on anecdotal evidence, but it does seem like there are certain jobs where people don't, at least they're not getting the full 8 hours of work in. And I do that as well. Like if I'm working 8 hours, I'm obviously not getting 8 hours of productive work, and I take breaks, and sometimes you just look at your phone or whatever. You're not being fully productive. And so if you took that time off, maybe you only have people work 4 hours a day, but they can't have their phones. They have to be super productive. Maybe you could get the same amount of work out of them.
Right. I mean, I've heard that kind of argument before, and there are some countries where it seems to work more like that. Like Germany, for example, is said to be more like that. I've never worked in Germany. I've never lived in Germany, but it's what I've read looking around on the internet. But it would require this very difficult culture transition. Because you're right, especially if you work in an office, and like maybe you don't have time if you're working in a factory or something to like mess around on your phone or something like that. But if you're working in an office and your job is to prepare like reports for middle management or something like that, tasks that can be accomplished with just like an hour or so of focused effort, and then the rest of the day is just sort of waiting for additional tasks that may or may not ever come. There's nothing else to do but to kind of mess around waiting for more work to happen. But to change it up, to move to this model wherein, okay, no, we're just going to ask them to do their work and then they can leave, right? Just come in and like complete your work, and then maybe you only have to work 4 hours, right? Well, when you're so used to this position wherein most of the time you spend at work is messing around, there is this worry I've heard expressed where like that transition would be very messy because people are so used to messing around that they aren't going to be able to accomplish what they need, doing their work in a very like serious, no break fashion. Now maybe that's an unfounded worry, right? But it is something. It is something I've had. Something I've heard. Basically, in effect. The argument is workers have become so used to being bad at working, right? In the sense of maintaining constant productivity.
Yeah.
That to suddenly expect them to remain constantly productive is asking too much.
Right. I just wonder if, the people that argue that, we do need 40 hours of work or something similar to that, like, how do you tell, like, what people are actually capable of? Like, maybe people are on their phones a lot, or just because they can only do a few hours of work a day and a focused work, and then the rest of the time is maybe some people could do 10 hours of focused work a day, but others can't. And so you're just asking people to be in an office or be in an environment that they're not actually suited for, and it's not going to increase any output. But we have the idea that businesses and capitalism always produces these efficiencies, which I'm not exactly sure is true.
I mean, it's also the case, though, once again, that there are different kinds of work, right? And some of them, like the coding job I mentioned earlier, might very well be the kind where you show up, and if you really crush out those 4 hours, you can finish your day's work, you know.
Hmm.
But there are going to be others like customer service representatives who are expected to be available, like
Hmm.
at the phone from this time to this time, and that's the job, not this task, right? It's you are here to be available to a customer or whatever. I mean, IT would work this way as well, so it's not just customer service, though IT, I guess, is a kind of customer service. But yeah,
Yeah.
so jobs that aren't explicitly like task oriented, that are more service oriented or something of the sort. Um, I'm not sure that idea of like, oh, we'll just crush out your hours really quickly. I don't. I'm not sure that could work for them.
Right. That is true. It does depend on the job. It actually does transition to our next comment, even though we didn't actually finish this one. But
Yeah, well, there's a lot here. I mean, we'll probably touch back on some of this. The only things of importance that we didn't really hit here, whether or not UBI is like
hmm
one, a good idea, and two, if it necessarily follows from automation. Uh, and then the last thing, obviously, the redistribution of wealth, right? Whether or not that's a thing that
yeah,
should be pursued. But what about this next one?
yeah. So I'm sure we'll get back to some of these topics
Yeah,
in a
oh,
little bit.
certainly. Yeah.
Okay, so this is from Twitter, and it's a exchange between three people. So the first one is a doctor, medical resident, who says, "You want to thank residents? Stop making this an acceptable work week." And there's a
Mm.
screenshot of um, an app showing the number of hours they've worked, which totals to 66 for the week. And then someone else replies, "After a weekend on call, sometimes I would work this much by Tuesday. This seems like a pretty standard work week, 6 12-hour days. With so many people trying to decrease the training work hours, how are the residents going to acclimate themselves to real practice when they finish?" So they're basically arguing that, yeah, this is a lot of hours, but you're going to have to work a lot of hours once you're done with your residency as a medical doctor. So you better get used to it.
Right.
And this other person responds, "I get that it sucks, but we only have so many doctors. You need to learn the skills in order to do this job effectively. This is part of the reality of the profession as it stands. Agree we should be better compensated, but 66 hours, shrug."
Mm-hmm.
So, just as you were talking about before, the number of hours that one could be expected to work or that one would need to work for a job, it depends on the specific job. And in this case, medical doctors are, have the reputation for having to work long hours, not only when they're actually a doctor, but in their training as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that might not really be avoidable if you want to, use the full capacity of the medical system to, give patients the best medical care possible. Because we only have so many doctors, and it takes a lot of training for people to be able to do surgeries and treat patients. And so, unless you want to have a lot of patients that might go untreated, you have to have a situation where doctors work long hours.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit more difficult to argue that, like a doctor should be working less when working less for doctors across the board might imply that people go untreated or even die, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you can ask the question, whether or not it can be any other way, right? Like the current reality, as this last comment in this thread points out, is this, it seems. Doctors work a lot. That is the current reality. Therefore, residents who are preparing to be, full doctors should adjust to that reality. Okay, but that's current reality. We have to ask the question, should it be this way?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of ways to go about that. One is to say, we'll accept the way things are in exchange for better compensation, which seems to be what the last person in this thread is going towards,
Mm-hmm.
right? We should be better compensated, blah, 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 right? That's one way to handle it. But, you can have all the money in the world if you, never get to see your family or do
Yeah.
anything with the money. I'm not sure it's worth all that much. And there's that thing we've been discussing so far a couple of times, when it seems like employees might be more effective, maybe not productive in terms of overall numbers, maybe even still, but at least more effective if they're well rested and happy, that kind of thing.
Right, they can certainly see more patients if they're working these crazy long hours,
Right, you can see more patients,
but yeah, I mean the quality. I mean, having had like I have a 6-month-old, and so I spent a lot of sleepless nights and had a lot of sleep deprivation. I would not want to, I don't even want to drive or anything like anything that's gonna potentially put myself or anyone else at risk. Like if you're that sleep deprived, you're working like crazy hours, like a lot of medical students do. Like you're not gonna be making the best decisions, and people's lives are at stake there.
right. Now maybe that's maybe there's compensation for that, given that medical care is never undertaken by a single. Like if you go to a hospital, you don't just have a single doctor looking after you. There's teams of nurses and other healthcare professionals who are involved. So maybe that kind of cross-checking can eliminate some of that, but still, it is somewhat worrisome. So one way to deal with it is to say, well, we'll just increase compensation. Yeah, it sucks, but get used to it. That's what it is. We at least get paid really well. And there's also the social prestige, of being a doctor. Another way is to say that while this is current reality, it does not have to be future reality, right? And there are some ways you could handle this for this profession specifically, right? Like you mentioned, and like the second person in this thread mentions, there's a certain kind of training that you need in order to be an effective doctor, or a doctor at all, right? And there just aren't enough people with that training to ease up these work hours, right? Maybe if you made the training more accessible, right? Maybe if admittances to medical schools were incentivized either by the government or someone else, private bodies, whatever, that would eventually maybe cut down on the need for doctors to work such hours. But again, that's kind of future oriented. That's not present case.
Right. And yeah, I mean, there are several options. I mean, like you said, you can increase the number of people who are admitted into medical school because there's clearly way more people that want to be doctors than can. And you can alleviate some of the responsibility by giving nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians, assistants more responsibility, which is happening in some cases.
I think we're also experiencing a shortage in nurses and nurse practitioners, though. So
that's true, and they also often work really long hours, and
they do.
They're not compensated to the same extent. But yeah, I mean, there's you could restructure the way things work, but you do still have the problem of what do you do right now in the meantime.
I mean, the same, like it's an obvious case with doctors, right? Everyone knows they work crazy hours. At least a lot of them do. But there are other professions that have much the same problem, right? Like firefighters, for example. Many nights they're sleeping at the firehouse, right? It's one of those jobs where you need to be on call, right? I guess it's more or less any profession where you need to be on call in order for the job to work, right? If you don't have anyone on call and you're a fire station, someone's got to respond to the fires, whatever time they occur. Same thing for EMS, right? More or less anything in a medical field that involves like emergency care, right? There's going to be long hours.
And some of that, I think, as you alluded to, is related to compensation in ways that aren't just monetary. So, like firefighters, for instance, like they might have to work long hours. They don't really get paid that well, but they have a lot of prestige. Because people don't hate firefighters like some people hate cops or
right. Well, I mean, a firefighter. I think it's because, or at least as people say, when you see a firefighter show up, they're not there to mess with you or anything. Like they're exclusively there to help.
Right. They just help people.
Right.
So yeah, like people, there's a lot of social value in being a firefighter. And same thing with a doctor, nurse, like all these positions. Like even if you're not compensated monetarily, you still do get some social capital from that. And yeah, I mean, it's similar to other professions where people get something else out of it. Like if they're passionate about it, they really enjoy what they do. That can be taken as a kind of compensation itself. Like, oh, maybe you have to work crazy hours. Like in academia, for instance, that's very common for people to work crazy hours and not necessarily be compensated super well, especially if like they're undergrad or graduate. But they're supposed to kind of take it because, oh, this is like something you love, right? You're doing this because you're passionate about it.
Right.
But that does lead the option to be exploited. And not being fairly compensated.
I mean, that common saying is something, what is it? Like, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, or something like that, right? Yeah, I mean, that's all well and good until someone exploits that passion.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I know that some, like, very highly ranked hospitals, for example, don't pay their doctors competitive salaries because they know that the doctors will stay there because of the prestige, right? It's like it's an honor for you to work here, right? And therefore we don't have to offer you like highly competitive salaries, which is, exploitative. Is what it is. But yeah, I mean, it seems like at least in present day, there are some professions where maybe working more than 40 hours a week simply can't be helped. If we want to meet the like needs of society, right?
Right.
Of course, we could leave
you could also take
untreated.
That's what I was gonna say. You could just take that and be like, well, having work-life balance is more important than like everybody, getting their colons checked or whatever. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sure. Okay, getting a colon checked, maybe you can do that, a week or two later. But getting treatment for a gunshot wound, now you want that doctor on call.
Yeah, that's true.
So that one's tricky. It's tricky. It seems like there might be room to say that this idea that a 40-hour work week should be universally abolished. One, as we mentioned, there are some people who do what they do and it's genuinely a passion for them, and maybe they're not being exploited. Like especially if they're like a homesteader or someone who's like working for themselves, like an entrepreneur of any kind, or if you're working in this kind of field where you doing your work is like necessary for like the social good, right? Maybe there's at the very least some exceptions to that argument. 40-hour work week should be abolished, blah blah blah.
Right. Yeah, that does seem to be the case. I think we should go to the next comment.
Yeah. This next one is a bit of a change up, right? So this is another comment from Reddit, replying to a question as to whether or not it's worth it to just continue working a 40-hour work week. Just waiting for the weekends for your entire life. This person says, well, there's a flip side to this as well. As consumers, we have to stop demanding that McDonald's and Walmart be open 24/7 and that our products get here in 2 days and that our Xboxes are never out of stock. We drive a lot of the practices that are driving those quotas up. And I pulled this one not because I honestly, I'm not sure I have much to disagree with here. I just think it's a pretty good take. Right? It's popular nowadays, at least amongst younger people, to say that we are working too much, right? That we're working too much. We should at least move down to a 4-day work week, etc. However, I and most people I know engage in these hyper consumeristic practices. I have my packages delivered by Amazon. Not in 2 days. In many cases, the next day, sometimes the same day. Right. I shop at stores incredibly late. Sometimes I'll go pick up some necessity from a grocery store at like 9 or 10 p.m. Right. It's difficult to argue that people shouldn't be working 40-hour work weeks and we should have 4-day work weeks, when your very practices, like as a consumer, demands so much labor, right? Like all of these things that I've mentioned, there are people behind that, right? And I don't mean big giant corporations. I mean single employees who are doing this labor. Someone, that thing I bought from Amazon that's going to get to me tomorrow when I could happily receive it 5 days later. Someone has to pull that from the shelf. Someone has to box it up. Someone has to move it down the line. It's got to get on a truck, which gets driven, and then it gets unpacked again, and then a mail carrier brings it to me. There's at minimum like 10 people involved in this process of getting this thing that I did not need at all, and it certainly didn't need the very next day, right?
Yeah, so I definitely think there's something to this where if you want to say that we should work fewer hours or we should cut down to like a 32 hours a week or whatever it is, 20 hours a week, then there would have to be some cost to that where you couldn't have the same access, as this person's saying, to like 24-hour access to food, grocery stores, because there just wouldn't be enough people to stock and to be there to work. So that's, I mean, for me, like if I didn't have to work as many hours and had to give up a little bit of the ease of life, like I would definitely do that. But that's something that is a very personal decision, and I think it's something that you can't really like ease into it, I guess, like, because it seems like the main way that if we are going to work fewer hours, if like the standard work week is going to go down from 40 hours a week, it's probably going to have to be through some government intervention, because that's what's happened in the past. People got exploited during the days of the Industrial Revolution, and the way that they got to work fewer hours is by government or by legislation. And so if that does happen, then we would see the effects after that. And so we wouldn't really get to sort of ease into that.
Right.
So we'd have to decide beforehand, is that something that we're willing to risk?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many people think about that kind of implication. It seems like most people are kind of pie in the sky with this kind of stuff. They think, we can lower our working hours, and that's not going to change my life at all, except I'm going to have more free time, maybe slightly less money, but way more free time. It's almost like they have this notion of like a Star Trek kind of utopia, right? Where for those not familiar with Star Trek, shame on you. They they have advanced in as a society to this form of economy where no one has to work anymore at all. No one has to work. People choose to work, but no one really has to. They don't even have money, right? Because whatever you need, you can get it. The key difference between a world like that in Star Trek and our world is that they have fabricators where they can literally make anything out of matter, right? They more or less can magic things into existence. We don't have that, right? If you want scarcity. That Big Mac at 11 p.m., there's a team of people that are going to be required to make that for you. Yeah. It's not a machine, right? There's not a magic machine that's going to make it for you. So your consumerism does require additional labor, right? You can't have one without the other, Unfortunately, we just don't have that kind of technology.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if people really did think about these consequences, how much they would really change their mind potentially about this. I do wonder about, like, I mean, this is an empirical question, how much it would change the ease of consumerism. But, France has pretty strict policies on, like, I think people can't work overnight shifts, at least in like certain professions, or like they're very strict in like what you can and can't do with regards to work. So, but I don't know, like, how much that's changed society there, how much like people value that or are upset by that. But yeah, again, it's kind of an empirical question, but it is something that's important to consider in your values.
We've used this phrase a few times now. I think probably in former episodes as well. Maybe we should unpack it. When we say it's an empirical question, what it's philosophical parlance. What that means is that this is a question that can only be answered with a fact of the matter, right? There is a fact that answers this question, and in order to answer it, we need that data, right? So it's one way or the other, depending on the data, and we don't have. Typically, when someone says, "Oh, that's an empirical question," what they mean is we can't answer that because we don't have the data, right?
Right. There's only so much you could do with thinking and
Speculate,
speculation.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, we are getting short on time. How about we do one more?
Okay. Yeah, this next one is a short one from Twitter. This person says, if you prioritize your happiness over hard work, it's likely you won't be successful or as successful as you could. Happiness doesn't always equal money. So this person's, this is kind of a, seems a little strange to me, but like most people, if you ask them like what they want, they'll say they want to be happy. But this person's saying you should actually prioritize hard work to be successful, and that might lead you to more happiness, or it might just be beneficial in its own way. But anyway, this is a, there's many. When I was looking for arguments, there are many of this type, which is like a hard work is good, it's virtuous, and like kind of a hustle culture mentality. Like get out there and do the hard work, and you'll benefit. You'll be successful.
Yeah, it's very much reminiscent of the like more recent version of hustler mentality, right? Wherein like the idea is no one's going to do it for you, right? And all that time you spent complaining, you could have been grinding, right? And it's not that they prize the grind itself. You could think so for at least some of them, but it's the willingness to stick with the grind in order to reach the results at the end that is prized, right? It's the stick to itness that is really prized by this sort of hustler, like entrepreneurial spirit that we're seeing in more recent years is this kind of like a direct response to this call for working less hours and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean that kind of this is a way of tying back in the notion of like universal basic income and things like that, right? People with this mindset will typically make some kind of argument like, you get what you earn, right? It's about earning it, right? It's about putting in the hours. That's what that's what gets you the reward, not waiting for someone to hand it to you, right? So I could see a person like this. I mean, I don't know about this person specifically, the one that you've pulled this quote from. You can't speak for them, but I could see some people with this kind of mindset arguing that something like universal basic income is a bad thing in principle, because it rewards something like laziness, or to put it another way, because it's unearned, right? It's like it sort of implies this form of entitlement. Like how are you entitled to this money when you've done nothing for it, right?
Right. Like if you put in the work and the sweat, you have grit, then what you get out of that, the money, the things you can purchase with that, like you'll appreciate and you'll be able to use it in ways that are good for you, maybe good for society. Whereas if you're just handed it, you won't have the same value attached to it. Yeah.
Now, one thing I think that this kind of the kind of people who make that kind of argument tend to miss, right, is that like they're very much into this idea of being self-made, of like achieving it on their own. Like I didn't have anyone help me or whatever. I like became a self-made millionaire, right? Like that's the dream of the standard like hustle culture person, right? And anyone who's like arguing for better wages or like wanting to put in less work, they're just being lazy. They're not putting in the grind like I am. One thing that they seem to miss frequently is that the other side is arguing for just compensation in their minds, not additional like compensation that they aren't entitled to. They are typically making the argument that they are being exploited by their employers, and that they are entitled to additional compensation or other measures, like reduced working hours, things like that, as compensation for that exploitation, right? So this goes back to that Reddit post we saw earlier where they compared the billionaires to the dragons, right? And we're arguing
Right.
for the redistribution of wealth, right? You can make a hustler style argument against the billionaire class, right? In what way are you entitled to all of this wealth when you haven't really put in any work for it, right? You get this wealth from exploiting, not from working, right? So
Right. Yeah,
that
like
is, I think there's some back and forth that could be had here between the two sides.
yeah. I mean, yeah, like Jeff Bezos or whatever billionaire, they may
Mm-hmm.
have had good ideas, they may have worked really hard, but they work thousands of or millions of times harder than, someone who's working at a fast food restaurant.
Right,
So I
right.
mean, there's something else going on there where like, the amount of work you put in is not directly proportional to what you get out of it. Some of it's luck, but some of it's once you pass a certain threshold, it's just easier to keep on going because you can use your wealth and your
Right.
power to
As people say,
create
your
more of it.
money makes money at a
Yeah.
certain point. Right. No labor involved. So yeah, I mean, and so if you prize as someone who prizes this notion of like stick to itness and hard work and grit and that kind of thing, um, maybe it's not the billionaire class that should be your heroes, right? Maybe it's the person in the office who, despite putting in more productivity than their parents and their grandparents did, are receiving less spending power, right? It's,
Mm.
they're working hard for less, which,
Mm-hmm.
if you value that kind of thing for some reason,
Well,
is maybe laudable.
I think this is, I mean, there's also something I didn't really see explicitly stated, but I think people do have the idea that hard work is its own reward to some extent, or at
Mm-hmm.
least um, is more valuable than, if you're like sitting around day just watching TV, if you do some kind of work that isn't wage labor, it's just, you go out and garden or clean up the house or care for a loved one. Um, or also doing some kind of like wage labor, like that's going to be more beneficial for you as a person. Is going to make you a better person than
Mm-hmm.
not working. And so that could also be an element of this hustle culture where it's not just the outcomes, however much money you make or what you can afford. It's really
Sure.
that you're the type of person that puts in the work, and like that is valuable in itself.
Yeah, that could certainly be a way they could go about it. I think that's better in some regards than being like explicitly results oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but uh, there are many people arguing now, especially with this new like anti-work movement on Reddit, right? That sometimes rest, right? They say rest or laziness, right, or idleness. These are all synonyms, right? Are is in itself like a good.
Mm-hmm.
Now their arguments for that are there's a few different ways you can go, right? One is, and I don't think this is an argument the anti-work people would use, but as we discussed previously, workers are more productive when they're well rested and that kind of thing. And so, therefore, laziness, idleness, etc., can be a boon for productivity, right? So, in the service of doing work better, rest can be valuable,
Right.
right? There are other arguments that rest is valuable in and of itself, um, but I think that it's just really it's too context dependent to really firmly say one way or the other. For example, if you're out in the bush or some badlands or something, and you desperately need to find food if you're going to survive, I'm not sure that just lying down and waiting to starve to death is the move. Um,
But at the
and
same
some
time, if resources are scarce when you're not like hunting or foraging, then it's good to rest because you want to conserve energy. So
true, but at some point, at some point,
at
some
some
work
point, you got
should
to
be
do
done.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, some work should be done at some point. Yeah. So to bring it back to like work instead of like a just explicit survival situation, right? Like, I mean, we can talk again about medical professionals, right? There are times in which them choosing to be lazy is probably a bad thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're a medical doctor and you're walking by down the street and someone desperately needs help, you could save them, right? But I'm taking a lazy day. I'm taking a lazy day. That's
Yeah.
it's questionable, right? That's questionable. Uh, so I don't think laziness is always a virtue, um, but maybe it is in certain respects.
Right.
Um,
That seemed to me like almost an overreaction from
mhm.
the hustle culture, or like the value that people put on work and hard work, is just to say like,
Yeah.
no, the opposite is actually valuable. Where maybe something in the middle is a little more
Right.
reasonable.
I agree. Yeah, it seems to be like a both movements seem to be like a strong reactions to one another. There are
Hmm.
people in the anti-work movement who are not just saying we should have a, whatever 30-20 hour work week, or 4 3 day, as the other person suggested,
Hmm.
work week, but rather that we should abolish work altogether. Um, and once again, we're not living in that Star Trek utopia, right? If we were to abolish work altogether, unless you plan on being a subsistence farmer, uh, I don't know how that's going to work out, right? Um, in the
Right.
long run. But on the other hand, this hustle culture idea of just keep putting in the hours and you'll see success, trade your happiness now for like success down the road, like it will pay off, it could come across as naive. If
Hmm.
there's genuine exploitation going on by employers, uh, then you can't count on that, right?
Right.
You might trade your whole life away and never see that result. Especially if what you're aiming for is, to become someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. Like
Right.
that's quite frankly not going to happen,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, if you're working two like full time jobs for minimum wage, like you're not going to be able to accumulate that kind of wealth. Like, and you're just like an injury away from
Yeah,
being in medical debt, and then just like in a
yeah,
spiral of poverty. Like, it's really hard to just like work your way out of poverty
right.
through grit and determination.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if you become some kind of entrepreneur and you get just a bit of luck, right, and you work really hard, maybe you can become a millionaire. Sure,
Hmm.
maybe you can, but it's important to note the world of difference between a millionaire, even a multimillionaire, and someone like Jeff Bezos, like a billionaire. I mean, it's an unimaginable degree of difference between the
Right.
two, right? So even if you work as hard as you possibly can and achieve that dream of being a multimillionaire, it doesn't compare to the wealth that can be accrued through exploitation, right? Uh, it just doesn't, right? So I don't know. The arguments for redistributing the wealth, that sort of thing, they're complex. That we go back into the topic of entitlement. Who's entitled to what, that kind of
Hmm.
thing. It's really messy. Um, but if the facts are that productivity has increased, and companies, corporations, etc., are reaping more profits than they ever have, yet spending potential of employees is going down, it seems like the only way to account for that is exploitation.
Mm. Yeah. Or if you're very pro-capitalist, there's probably like a word you could use that's not exploitation, but
That's
means
not
basically the same thing.
charged like exploitation. Yeah, yeah.
It's
You agree to it. I mean, there is a yeah. If
efficiency
you're
maximization or something. Yeah.
mhm. If you're super capitalist, that I think the right argument is to say something like, "Listen, no one, you're not a slave. You're not
Hmm.
forced to work for them. Go find another job. Go become an entrepreneur. Start your own business." I mean, a lot of these things, like the immediate response from the other side is going to be something like, "That is easier said than done." You know, like I have mouths to feed. You know, blah blah blah. Blah, um, there's many excuses that are taken to be like legitimate ones for why you have to work for someone else. Um, but at the end of the day, there is some truth in the matter that the job you have, at least here in the U.S., right? It's one you agree to. It's one you
Yeah.
agree to, and theoretically, maybe not in maybe not in practice, depending on your needs, but theoretically could leave at any time,
Right.
right?
It's easier for some people than others. So.
Oh yeah, yeah, certainly
All right.
so.
Well, it's been about an hour 15, so I think we should wrap up. Um,
All right, sounds good to me. Once again, there's more to talk about here,
yeah.
um, but there's so much more to say, and some of it we aren't exactly qualified to say.
Hmm.
Uh, but anyway, we hope it's been interesting at the very least.
Yeah.
If you have any comments or suggestions or ad hominems that you would like to throw our way, feel free to do so in the comments below, and in the future we might respond to them. I think we also have an email address, right?
Yep. Arguing with the internet at gmail.com.
And that they can find in the description.
Yep.
We're also available in audio form, if that's more interesting to you. Can also find a link in the description, I believe.
Yep.
But yeah, I think that's about it for this time.
All right. See you next time.
Yep, see you next time.